Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Really excited today. We're digging into the latest weather analysis for Azerbaijan, specifically looking at July 3rd through to the 12th, 2025. And our mission, as always, is to go beyond just the numbers, right? Connect the dots between the immediate forecast, historical stuff, and, the bigger climate change picture, especially in a country like Azerbaijan, so central to climate talks right now.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because while this specific 10-day period might look fairly stable, maybe even unremarkable on the surface, the broader context, well, it really shows these persistent heightened risks. And dealing with those, that needs a really proactive stance.
Okay, so let's start with that immediate forecast then.
Yeah.
What are we seeing? You mentioned warming.
Yeah, a general warming trend. You see it particularly in places like Baku and also Nakhchivan.
Right.
But what's maybe more important is the real field temperature, what it actually feels like. In Baku, that's projected to get up to 34.4 Celsius. That's about 94 Fahrenheit by July 10th to 12th.
Wow, okay. And that's bumping right up against their threshold, isn't it?
Exactly. Azerbaijan uses 35 Celsius as a kind of benchmark for heat stress. So 34.4 is really close. Close enough to definitely impact, activity, health. We're also looking at some potentially strong wind gusts. Maybe up to 30 miles per hour on the 4th in Baku.
Yeah.
But overall, probably low chance of rain.
Okay, low rain chance. That fits, right? July is usually super dry in Baku.
It is, historically. Average maybe one rain day, barely any accumulation, 2, maybe up to 8 millimeters, perhaps. Very little.
So a dry forecast seems logical.
Yeah, but here's the kind of paradox we need to think about. Even with low overall rain probability, climate change seems to be upping the chances of really intense but very localized thunderstorms, flash floods. We saw warnings about this potential back in May, just a couple of months ago in 2025. And Azerbaijan's vulnerability to floods, well, it's significant. About 100,000 people affected every year. So dry average doesn't mean zero risk of sudden heavy rain.
That's a critical point. And it ties into this wider context, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Azerbaijan hosting COP29 this year.
Right.
While economically, over 90% of its exports are still tied to fossil fuels. That's quite the tension.
It really is. And it highlights this incredibly complex policy challenge. The country was already about 1.3 degrees Celsius hotter back in 2010 compared to pre-industrial levels.
Yeah.
So you have this clear climate impact reality clashing with, well, economic dependence. It's a tough balancing act.
And looking back, they've had some serious heat events. I remember reading about a record high of 43 Celsius.
That's 109 Fahrenheit, yeah.
And didn't they have a major power outage in Baku back in 2018? Because everyone was running their AC during a heat wave just like that.
They did, and the data on heat escalation is frankly quite stark. If you look at the number of days hitting 35 Celsius or higher in Baku, between 1960 and 1990, there were 86 such days. Then from 1991 to 2020, that number jumped to 365 days.
365. That's nearly a fourfold increase.
Pretty much, it's a huge surge.
So, okay, bringing it down to ground level, what does all this mean for people, living and working there?
Well, the impacts sort of cascade, don't they? You've got direct public health risks, heat stroke, exhaustion, maybe worse conditions for people with existing issues, potentially more vector-borne diseases too, as insects shift ranges. Then there's labor productivity. Estimates suggest losses could reach up to 7% in sectors like construction by 2030, just from heat stress. And in a big city like Baku, the urban heat island effect just makes everything worse. The city itself traps heat.
Right, the concrete and building. And what about the Caspian Sea? That's such a defining feature. Its average July temperature near Baku is around 24 degrees C now.
Around that, yeah. But the trend there is also really significant. We've seen major warming over the last decade. The South Caspian actually hit 30 Celsius back in 2021. And you have to remember, something like 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases ends up in the oceans. That makes this warming effectively irreversible on human timescales. It contributes to the sea shrinking, which messes with the whole ecosystem, local weather. Everything.
Okay, so a lot of background risk. Now, our sources didn't flag any specific official warnings for this July 3rd to 12th period itself.
That's right. Nothing specific for these exact dates that we saw. But that doesn't mean you ignore the risks. General safety advice from the Ministry of Emergency Situations, the MES, is always relevant. For floods, strong winds, even lightning strikes, it really points towards needing constant real-time monitoring and shifting towards what they call a risk-informed strategy, being prepared generally.
And that vulnerability you mentioned earlier plays in here too, right? Water scarcity is a big one. Reserves down like 20% in 30 years.
Huge issue.
And agriculture employs so many people, about 1 in 3 jobs. very climate sensitive.
Absolutely, which is why Azerbaijan's National Adaptation Plan, the NAP, is so important. It was projected for release this year, 2024. It specifically focuses on adapting agriculture, water resources, and coastal zones. Plus, they have conditional emission reduction targets, aiming for 40% below 1990 levels. So there's recognition, there are plans, but the scale of change demands really robust ongoing action.
So wrapping this up, it feels like even if the weather forecast for the next, say, week and a half looks relatively okay, the bigger story is this landscape that's just rapidly changing because of climate change.
Exactly. It really underlines this urgent need for proactive adaptation. We're talking continuous monitoring, better heat preparedness plans, smarter water management, and crucially, figuring out how to balance economic needs with those climate commitments. Plus, public awareness has to be part of it. And it leaves us with a big question, really. In a world where these climate impacts are just getting harder and harder to ignore, how do we effectively bridge that gap between the short-term, day-to-day forecast and building genuine long-term resilience?
That is definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for breaking that down for us. And thanks to you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.